My mother died on a Tuesday in March, and it was only after the funeral that I learned she had been lying to me for 15 years. I don't say that to shock you. I say it because it is simply the truth, and the truth is what this story is about. My name is Dorothy. I am 68 years old. My mother, Helen, passed away 2 years ago at the age of 91. She lived a long, full life. She raised 4 children, buried a husband, survived a Depression-era childhood and a war and the loss of 2 siblings, and through it all, she was the steadiest person I have ever known. If you had asked anyone in our family to describe my mother in one word, they would have said honest. Brutally, sometimes uncomfortably honest. She did not believe in soft lies, the kind people tell to spare feelings. She believed the truth, however hard, was always the kinder choice in the end. That is what made what I found in her closet 3 weeks after we buried her so impossible to understand at first that I was the one who cleaned out her house. My siblings live far away, one in Oregon, one in Florida, one who passed before her. And so the task fell to me, the daughter who had stayed close, who had visited every Sunday for the last 20 years of her life, who thought, right up until the day I opened a shoebox at the back of her closet shelf, that I knew everything there was to know about my mother. I did not know everything. What I found that afternoon, sitting on the floor of her bedroom with dust motes floating in the late afternoon light, was a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon, a small velvet box containing a ring that was not my father's, and a photograph of a man I had never seen in my entire life, standing beside my mother in front of a house I did not recognize, both of them young and laughing, in what looked like the late 1960s. My mother would have been about 30 years old in that photograph. Already married to my father. Already raising me and my older brother. And standing beside a man who was not him. I sat on that floor for almost 2 hours before I could move. And in those 2 hours, I began to understand that the woman who taught me honesty was a champion at one particular kind of lie. The kind built entirely out of silence, maintained so carefully, for so long, that not one of her 4 children, not her husband of 58 years, not a single soul in our family, ever suspected a thing. This is the story of what I found. And more than that, it is the story of why she kept it hidden, and what it taught me, in the end, about the difference between a lie and a sacrifice. To understand what I found, you first need to understand who my mother was before she became the woman I knew. Helen was born in 1931, the third of 6 children, on a small farm outside a town in rural Missouri. Her childhood was the kind that doesn't exist anymore in this country. No electricity until she was nearly 10, water hauled from a well, a one-room SC. Schoolhouse 3 miles down a dirt road that she walked every day, even in the worst Missouri winters. She used to tell us, when we were children complaining about some minor discomfort, you don't know cold until you've walked 3 miles in February with cardboard in your shoes because the soles wore through. She lost 2 siblings young, one to scarlet fever, one in the war. She grew up fast, the way people did in those years, because there wasn't really a choice. By the time she was 18, she had already buried more people than most of us bury in a lifetime, and she had developed the particular kind of steadiness that comes from learning early that life does not owe you softness. She met my father, Robert, in 1952. He was a returning veteran, quiet and serious, working at a hardware store in the same town where she had taken a job as a seamstress. They married within a year of meeting, quick by some standards, but not unusual for that era. And by all accounts, theirs was a good, steady marriage. Not a passionate, dramatic love story. Something quieter than that. Something built on mutual respect and shared work and the particular intimacy of 2 people who have decided, plainly and without much fuss, to build a life together. My older brother Frank was born in 1954. I came along in 1957. My younger siblings, Carol and James, followed in 1960 and 1963. We grew up in a modest house in a small Missouri town, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where my mother was known as one of the most capable, no-nonsense women in the community. She ran the church bake sale. She sat on the school board. She was the person other women called when they needed advice, because Helen always told you the truth, even when the truth was hard to hear. And somehow that made people trust her more rather than less. My father worked steadily at the hardware store, and eventually became its manager. We were not wealthy, but we were comfortable, and more importantly, we were stable. There was a predictability to our childhood that I now understand, as an adult, was a tremendous gift. Dinner at 6 every night, church every Sunday, a mother who showed up to every school event, a father who, though quiet, never missed a baseball game or a school play. This is the family I grew up believing in completely. But here is something I did not know until I found those letters. In 1961, 2 years before my brother James was born, my mother left my father for 4 months. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters enormously to the rest of this story. She did not simply have an affair in secret, the way the photograph might suggest at first glance. She actually left. She packed a bag. She told my father she needed time, and she went to stay with her sister in St. Louis for 4 months, taking my brother Frank and me. I would have been about 4 years old, with her. I have no memory of this period. None at all. I was too young. My brother Frank, who would have been 7, also claims, even now, to have no clear memory of it. Only a vague sense, he told me once after I shared what I'd found, of a strange summer when things felt different. My mother and father reconciled. She came back. They never spoke of it again, not once, not in 60-some years of marriage. Not even after he passed away in 2009, and she lived another 13 years as a widow with, presumably, no one left in the world who shared the memory of that particular chapter except herself. The man in the photograph, the one standing beside her in front of an unfamiliar house, both of them young and laughing, was, I would later learn, a man named Arthur. A man my mother met during those 4 months in St. Louis. A man she very nearly built an entire different life around, before she made the choice to come home. This is not a story about an affair, not really. It is a story about a woman who, at 30 years old, stood at the edge of an entirely different life and chose, deliberately, to walk away from it, and then carried the full weight of that choice, completely alone, in total silence, for the rest of her life. I did not understand, sitting on her bedroom floor that afternoon, why she had never told anyone. Not my father, apparently, beyond whatever was said in those 4 months. Not me, not any of her children. Across 60 years of opportunities to share even a fragment of this enormous, formative chapter of her life. It took me a long time, and a great deal of reading through those letters, to understand why. And what I learned changed completely how I understood my mother. Not as a betrayal of who I thought she was, but as a far deeper, more complicated kind of love than I had ever given her credit for. The letters were dated across a span of about 6 months in 1961, beginning in March and ending in September. I want to tell you, before I go further, that reading another person's private letters, especially your own mother's, written when she was younger than I am now reading them, to a man I never knew existed, felt like a strange kind of trespass. I debated, more than once, whether to stop. Whether some things are meant to stay buried, even after the person who buried them is gone. But I kept reading, because I think, somewhere in me, I understood that my mother had spent 60 years protecting all of us from something, and the very least I owed her, now that she could no longer protect that secret herself, was to actually understand what she had been protecting us from. The early letters were ordinary at first. The kind of correspondence you'd expect between 2 people in a small social circle. My mother had gone to St. Louis to help her sister, my Aunt Ruth, who had just had a difficult birth and needed help with her newborn and her other small children. Arthur was a neighbor of my aunt's, a widower, it turned out, in his mid-30s, raising 2 young sons alone after losing his wife to illness 2 years earlier. The first few letters between them were practical. A note about a dish she had left at his house after bringing dinner for his boys one evening. A thank you for help moving a piece of furniture. The kind of small, neighborly exchanges that happen in any close community. But by the 3rd letter, dated late April, something had shifted. My mother wrote about a conversation they'd had on his back porch one evening, after the children were asleep, about grief. His grief for his wife, and something else, something she described only obliquely, about the weight of always being the strong one, the one who holds everyone else up. I sat with that sentence for a long time when I first read it, because that was exactly how I would have described my mother, my whole life. The one who holds everyone else up that I had never once considered, until that letter, that being the strong one might be its own kind of exhausting. That my mother. Steady, capable, endlessly reliable Helen, might have spent her whole life feeling unseen in her own strength, cared for everyone, leaned on by everyone, and rarely, if ever, the one being asked how she was actually doing. Arthur saw her. That much was clear from every letter that followed. He wrote to her about small things, the way she laughed at something his younger son said, the quiet competence with which she handled a household emergency one evening when his older boy got sick. But underneath the small things, there was something larger building. A man who, in his loneliness and his grief, had begun to genuinely see a woman who, by her own admission in one particularly raw letter, had started to wonder, for the first time in my entire life, if I am more than just useful to the people around me. I want to pause here and tell you something about my father, because I think it's important, and I think it would be unfair to him to let this story suggest he was somehow cold or neglectful. He wasn't. My father loved my mother in his own quiet, undemonstrative way, the way many men of his generation loved, through providing, through steadiness, through simply being present, decade after decade, without much need for words. But love expressed entirely through steadiness can sometimes feel, to the person receiving it, like being taken for granted. Not because the love isn't real, but because it isn't spoken. My mother, by 1961, had been married for 8 years. She had given birth to 2 children. She had run a household with precision and competence that, I now understand, was rarely acknowledged out loud by anyone, including my father, simply because it ran so smoothly that its difficulty became invisible. And then she met a man who, in the middle of his own grief, looked at her and said, in essence, I see how hard this is for you. I see you, not just what you do for everyone else. By June, the letters had become something else entirely. Not just correspondence between friends, but something with real weight and real danger in it. My mother wrote, in a letter dated June 14th, about a walk they had taken together along the river while their children played nearby, and she described it with a kind of careful, restrained intensity that told me everything I needed to know about how deeply she had fallen. She wrote, I have not felt this alive in years, Arthur. I don't know what to do with that feeling. It frightens me as much as it comforts me. I read that line perhaps a dozen times. Because it was the first time in 68 years of being my mother's daughter that I had ever encountered evidence of Helen feeling frightened by anything at all. By July, things had clearly become serious between them in every sense. There is a letter from Arthur, the only ones from him that my mother had kept, dated July 22nd, in which he wrote plainly that he had fallen in love with her, that he believed she had fallen in love with him too, and that he wanted to know, gently, without pressure, but directly, whether she could imagine a life with him and his 2 boys, joined with her and her 2 children, built fresh, separate from whatever she had left behind in her marriage. My mother did not answer that letter for almost 3 weeks. I know this because the next letter in the stack, in her handwriting, is dated August 11th, and it begins, I am sorry for my silence. I have spent 3 weeks trying to understand my own heart, and I am still not entirely sure I do. What followed, across the next 6 pages, the longest letter in the entire collection, was the most honest accounting I have ever read of a person trying to weigh an impossible choice. She wrote about her love for Arthur, which she did not minimize or apologize for. She wrote about how being with him had shown her a version of herself she had forgotten existed. Someone interesting, someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered to another person simply because they were hers, not because of what she could provide. But she also wrote about Frank and me, about what it would mean to build a new life that required, in some fundamental way, dismantling the one her children already knew. About my father. Not in romantic terms, but in terms of basic decency, of what it meant to walk away from a man who had never once been unkind to her, simply because she had found something with someone else that felt, in that particular season of her life, more alive. And she wrote one line near the very end of that letter, that I believe is the true center of this entire story. She wrote, I think the difference between a good choice and a happy one is that a good choice considers everyone it touches, and a happy one only considers yourself. I am not sure yet which kind of woman I want to be. The final letters in the collection tell the story of what happened next, though I had to piece it together carefully, because by this point my mother was writing fewer and fewer details and more about feeling, as if the closer she got to her decision, the harder it became to put any of it into plain words. In late August, she made a trip back to our hometown, alone without Frank and me, who stayed with my Aunt Ruth in St. Louis for that visit. I do not know, and the letters don't say directly, what happened on that trip. But based on what came after, I believe she went home to see my father. To talk with him, honestly, about where things stood in their marriage and what she was feeling. I will never know exactly what was said between them in that conversation. My father passed away in 2009, and even if I had known to ask him while he was alive, I am not certain he would have told me, given how completely the subject was buried for the rest of his life. But something in that visit changed the direction of everything that followed. The letter dated September 3rd. The second to last in the collection is different in tone from everything before it. Quieter, more resolved, in the particular way that comes not from happiness, but from having finally made an impossible decision and simply needing to live inside it now. She wrote to Arthur. I went home and I sat across the kitchen table from Robert, and he asked me very plainly if I was happy. And I realized, sitting there, that the question itself was the wrong one. Happiness is not the only thing a life is built from. I have spent the last 6 months feeling more alive than I have ever felt, and I do not regret one moment of feeling that. But I have 2 children who know nothing of any of this, who simply know their mother left for the summer, and is now deciding whether to come home. And I have a husband who has never once, in 8 years, given me a single reason to leave him beyond the quiet, ordinary fact that he does not know how to make me feel the way you have made me feel this summer. She continued, I think, Arthur, that I am not choosing Robert because I love him more than I love you. I think I am choosing my children's stability over my own happiness, and I am choosing it with my eyes completely open, knowing exactly what I am giving up. I do not know if that makes me brave or simply afraid. I suspect, if I am honest, it is some combination of both. I had to put the letter down when I read that paragraph. I sat on the floor of my mother's bedroom, 68 years old myself, and I cried in a way I had not cried even at her funeral 3 weeks earlier. Because in that letter, written 61 years before I ever read it, my mother had made a choice that shaped the entire rest of my life, and I had never once, in all my decades as her daughter, understood the weight of what that choice had cost her. I thought about my own childhood, the stability she described protecting, the dinner at 6 every night, the church every Sunday, the predictability that I had always taken entirely for granted, the way children take for granted the very things their parents wore hardest and sacrifice most to provide. I had grown up inside the exact gift my mother gave up an entire different life to provide for me, and I had never known it existed until she was already gone, and could no longer tell me herself. The final letter, dated September 19th, is short. It is the letter where she tells Arthur she is staying with my father. She does not dress it up with false comfort or unnecessary cruelty. She writes simply, I am coming home to Robert, and to the life I have already built. I am asking you not to write to me again, not because I do not love you. I do, and I suspect some part of me will always carry this summer with me, but because I do not believe I can build the life I have chosen while also holding on to this one, even at a distance. I am sorry. I do not think sorry is a big enough word for what I am asking us both to carry, but it is the only one I have. She kept his letters anyway. All these decades, tied carefully with ribbon, hidden at the back of a closet shelf, carried with her through every house she and my father ever lived in, every move, every renovation, every decade of a marriage that lasted, in the end, 58 years. I do not know what became of Arthur. There is no record in her papers of her ever trying to find out. I do not know if he remarried, if his sons grew up well, if he ever forgave her, or himself, for the way that summer ended. That part of the story, I suspect, is simply gone now, carried by people I will never meet, in a chapter of my mother's life that closed completely the day she decided to come home. What I do know is this. My mother came back to my father in September of 1961. And from that point forward, for the next 48 years of marriage until his death, and then for the 13 years she lived as his widow, she never once, as far as any of us ever knew, gave any indication that her heart had ever wandered anywhere else. She built, with absolute and unwavering commitment, exactly the life she described choosing in that letter. She raised 4 children with steady, reliable love. She stood beside my father through illness, through the ordinary hardships of a long marriage, through the slow accumulation of decades. She became, in every visible way, exactly the woman I always believed her to be. Except that I now understood there was an entire hidden chapter beneath that visible life, a chapter she had chosen, with full awareness of what it cost her, to carry completely alone. That I sat with those letters for almost a week before I told anyone what I had found. I want to explain why, because I think the reasoning matters. My first instinct, like most people's would be, I imagine, was to call my siblings immediately. Frank, Carol, the whole scattered remainder of our family. To say, "You will not believe what I found in Mom's closet." But the longer I sat with it, the more that instinct felt wrong to me. Because what I had found was not gossip. It was not a scan meant to be shared and dissected. It was the most private, most carefully guarded chapter of my mother's entire inner life, and she had chosen deliberately across 60 years, never to share it with a single one of her children. I had to ask myself a hard question. Did finding it after her death give me the right to undo on her behalf, a choice she had made so consistently and so completely for so long? I thought about it for that whole week. I read the letters again, several times. I looked at the photograph of her and Arthur, both of them so young, so unguarded, captured in a single moment of a happiness she ultimately chose not to keep. And I tried to understand what she would have wanted me to do with what I now knew. In the end, I made a decision that I still believe was the right one, though I recognize others might have chosen differently. I told my brother Frank. Not the others. Not yet, and as it turned out, not ever, though that part of the story is its own complicated thing I'll come to. But Frank specifically, because he was the only one of us old enough, even at 7 years old in 1961, to have any conscious memory at all of that strange, unexplained summer when our mother took us to St. Louis and our family's rhythm shifted in ways neither of us had ever understood. I called him on a Sunday evening. I read him portions of the letters over the phone, my voice breaking more than once. I told him about Arthur, about the 4 months, about the choice our mother made, and the entire life she gave up in order to come home to the one we grew up inside. Frank was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said something I will never forget. He said, "Dorothy, do you remember the rocking chair in Mom and Dad's bedroom? The one she used to sit in every night, even when we were grown and gone, just rocking, not reading, not doing anything, just sitting there for 20, 30 minutes some nights." I told him I remembered it. I had always assumed it was simply a habit, a way she unwound at the end of long days. Frank said, "I used to wonder about that chair. There was something about the way she sat in it. Somewhere else, you know? Like her body was in the room, but the rest of her had gone someplace far away. I never understood it. I think maybe I do now." That image has stayed with me ever since. My mother, decades after that summer in St. Louis, sitting alone in a rocking chair in the dark, somewhere far away in her own mind, perhaps thinking of a man and a life she had chosen, with full clarity, never to have, and never once, in all those quiet evenings, letting a single one of us know what she was carrying. Frank and I talked for almost 2 hours that night. We talked about our father, about whether he had known the full truth of what almost happened in 1961, about what kind of conversation might have passed between them in that kitchen the day she came home to make her decision. We will never know the full answer to that. It is one of the many things that died with both of them, sealed permanently into a past neither of us can fully access. But we talked, too, about something larger than the specific facts of what happened. We talked about what it meant that our mother, the most rigorously honest person either of us had ever known, had carried this one enormous silence for 60 years, and what that silence had actually cost her. I do not think it is a small thing, to give up a life you know would make you happy, in order to protect the stability of children who will never even know there was anything to protect them from. I do not think it is a small thing to carry that choice alone, without ever once being able to share its weight with another living soul, for 6 decades. I asked Frank, near the end of our call, whether he thought we should tell Carol and James, our younger siblings. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I don't know, Dorothy. What would it give them knowing? It wouldn't change anything about how she raised us. It would just give them a different, more complicated mother to grieve, instead of the one they already know how to miss." I thought about that for a long time afterward. In the end, Frank and I decided, together, not to tell Carol or James. Not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because we both came to believe that the choice our mother made in 1961, to protect her children's stability even at tremendous personal cost, deserved, in some sense, to be honored even now, even after her death. She had carried this alone to give us a simpler, steadier childhood. It felt right somehow, to let our younger siblings keep the simpler, steadier memory of her that they already had, undisturbed by a chapter she herself had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly across 60 years, never to share. I know not everyone would make that same choice. I know some people reading this might believe siblings deserve to know the full truth of their own family history, regardless of how complicated or painful that truth might be. I respect that view. I simply did not, in the end, share it. When it came to honoring what I believe my mother would have wanted, what Frank and I did decide to do was visit her grave together that spring, just the two of us, and have the kind of conversation about her that we had never had while she was alive. Not about the dishes she made or the rules she enforced or the steady rhythms of the childhood she gave us, but about who she actually was, underneath all of that. A woman who, at 30 years old, had stood at the edge of an entirely different life and chosen, with full and devastating clarity, to walk away from it for the sake of people who would spend the next 60 years having no idea what she had given up for them. That I brought the photograph with me that day. The one of her and Arthur, young and laughing. I left it at her grave, tucked beneath some flowers, not because I wanted to bury the memory further, but because I felt, in some way I cannot fully explain, that it belonged there with her. A piece of the whole, complicated, fully human woman she actually was, rather than just the simplified, steady mother we had always known. I have thought, often, in the 2 years since I found those letters, about what this story actually means. About what I am supposed to take from discovering that my mother, honest, steady, unwavering Helen, carried the largest secret of her life in complete silence for 60 years. For a while, I thought the lesson was about honesty, about how even the most honest people we know are carrying things we will never see, and how dangerous it can be to assume we ever fully know another person, even someone we have loved our entire lives. That is true, I think. But I have come to believe it is not the deepest truth in this story. The deepest truth, I believe, is about the nature of sacrifice, and how rarely we recognize it when it is happening around us, because real sacrifice is almost always invisible. It does not announce itself. It does not ask for credit. My mother did not come home from St. Louis in 1961 and tell my father, or me or anyone, I am giving up a man I love and a different life I could have had, so that you children can have a stable home. She simply came home, and she built that stable home, day after day, decade after decade, without ever once cashing in the enormous credit she could have claimed for the choice she had made. Did I think about all the small moments of her steadiness that I took entirely for granted throughout my whole life. Dinner on the table every night, her presence at every school event, her calm in every family crisis. And I understand now that some portion of that steadiness was not simply her nature. Some portion of it was a choice, renewed every single day, to honor a decision she had made when she was 30 years old, even on the nights when honoring it must have been almost unbearably hard. I think of her in that rocking chair, decades later, somewhere far away in her own mind, and I no longer see that image as strange or unexplained. I see it as the visible edge of an invisible cost she paid, quietly, for 60 years, so that the rest of us could have the uncomplicated childhood we remember so fondly. I do not believe my mother was a perfect person. I do not believe choosing to stay in her marriage was the only right choice available to her, or that a different woman, in the same circumstances, would necessarily have been wrong to choose differently. I have made my peace with the fact that her decision came at a real cost to her own happiness, and I do not think pretending otherwise would honor her honestly. But I believe, with everything in me, that what she did was an act of profound love. The quiet, unglamorous, almost entirely unacknowledged kind of love that asks nothing in return and rarely receives any recognition at all, because its entire purpose is to remain invisible, so that the people it protects can simply live their lives without ever needing to carry its weight themselves. If you are someone who has carried a sacrifice quietly, for the sake of someone else's stability or happiness, a choice nobody around you ever knew you made, A different life you set aside so that the people you love could have an easier one. I want you to know that I see you, even though I cannot know your specific story the way I came to know my mother's. I want you to know that the people you have protected, even if they never find out what it cost you, are living inside a gift you gave them. And maybe, like me, they will only understand the full shape of that gift long after you are gone. But the gift itself was real, every single day.